Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon to our friends in Europe as well. We're pleased to present to you today SoundCheck 12 and an introduction to the new features in the latest release of our SoundCheck audio test system. My name is Brian Fallon. I'm an applications engineer and acting as product manager on SoundCheck currently. I've been using SoundCheck now since version 4, and I'm really excited about this upcoming release as we have a lot of really exciting new features to show to you. So here is just a rundown of the new features, the major ones, and then I will go through each one individually and give you a description and show you a little bit in SoundCheck. So we have a new single file sequence format, the setup and upgrade wizard, a new utility that we've added to SoundCheck, the ability to open SoundCheck without a sequence loaded, a new sort of offline mode for using SoundCheck, tabs to the displays, which helps you navigate your display steps. Relative file paths, making it easier to move sequences from one system to another. Sound map integration, finally taken our sound map application and integrated it into SoundCheck as a module. A calibration editor reformat, we've just changed the way that the calibration editor looks and the way you use it a little bit. And added a histogram to the offline statistics. So, number of new features, and let me switch over to sharing my screen and we will get started. Okay, single file sequence. This is a rather large change that will hopefully make SoundCheck a whole lot easier for people to use. Let me back up here. So rather than calling on specific step files when you open a SoundCheck sequence, now the sequence file, the .sqc, will contain all of the sequence parameters. So what that means is now you only need a single file instead of a whole group of files in order for a test sequence to run. One major change that this implements is that every parameter in all of your steps essentially becomes a blue field. If you have used SoundCheck extensively and have learned how to use the blue and the black fields where we had some local parameters and some global, you know that people could often make mistakes and change a global parameter in one sequence that would potentially affect another sequence. Well, that whole problem goes away because now every parameter is stored in the sequence file. So everything is isolated. Making a change in one sequence can't have an impact on another sequence. So that's really going to make sequence editing a whole lot simpler. So sharing and updating sequences will also be quite a bit easier. When you move from one version of SoundCheck to another, in the past we've had to export sequences, and then you could either import them or make sure you kept track of all of your step files. Well, in SoundCheck 12, now that you have a single file for each sequence, you simply take your .sqc, you can make yourself a new copy of it, and open it up in the new version. So moving forward, updating your version of SoundCheck is going to be so much easier, and we hope that will encourage people to do so more often. Also, sharing sequences from one system to another is a lot easier because now you do only have your one sequence file. In SoundCheck 11, we removed hardware and calibration from the sequences, which also implemented this change. But by having one file for your sequence, you can envision how you can just take a group of sequences, move them to another system, and be up and running very quickly. So making updates to the production line, sharing sequences with another facility, all of that is going to be greatly simplified. And as I mentioned with the blue and the black fields, the chance of user error, especially on those multi-user systems where you have a number of people using the same SoundCheck sequences and somebody accidentally makes a change in one, it has a trickle-down effect to a bunch of other sequences. That will no longer happen, as every sequence parameter will remain isolated. We'll switch over to my SoundCheck here. And just to show you a little bit about the single file sequence, let me pull up a Windows Explorer and just give you an example. So here are two exported sequences. This one is from SoundCheck 11. And if I look in the folder here, you'll see a very familiar view where you have a whole number of step files. And every step file must be in place in order for the sequence to run properly. Here's my 1.sqc file. And if I scroll down, you see I have a number of step files. So I have to keep this entire folder intact as I move it from place to place to make sure that the whole sequence opens and edits properly. And if I wanted to make a change, let's say on this system, and then send it over to another system, I would have to make sure I sent this whole folder and they make sure that everything gets updated. Now if you take a look at that same sequence that I have updated for SoundCheck 12, you see I have one file. Much simpler to keep track of. The file size is a little bit bigger, but you see it's still even less than 2 megabytes. Not all that big in the grand scheme of things. So now we have our one sequence file, and I've actually created a folder here to store my data in, which I'll get to a little bit later. Now as far as editing the sequences goes, let me open up a test sequence. The sequence editor remains pretty much the same, but the way that the steps get interacted with between the left and the right side has changed. So previously in SoundCheck 11 and every version before that, your left side was your step library. You chose a step file to add into your sequence. By adding it, your sequence would always just reference back to that file. The main difference now is that these are called step templates. So everything on the left-hand side is treated as a template. Once you take it and add it to your sequence, it now loses its connection to the original file and becomes its own line in your sequence. From here, you can make whatever changes to it you want and not worry about it getting back to the file over here and changing any other sequences. To aid in that, one of the ideas is that you'll have less step templates than you ever did before. And so now once you take a step template, add it to your sequence, you can right-click on it and immediately rename. And by hitting the rename, you could call it whatever you want. But it's not the same as using the save as function. Because you see, now that I have a step called final display, there's no final display over in my templates on the left side. So by this way, you'll have a few templates that you use, steps that you use quite a bit, and then you'll be able to modify them over in your sequence, make new versions, give them a more descriptive name that tells you exactly what the step is doing. Now, if you wanted to create a new template, you could certainly do that. From the steps, we still have the save as function. And so if you click save as, it will give you the opportunity to give your step template a new name, which will then appear over in the step library. So you see the basic process of creating a test sequence is still the same. You still grab steps from the left side, move them into your sequence. But the main difference now is that you have a lot of flexibility, because once your steps are in your sequence, you can make whatever changes you want and not worry about impacting any of your other test sequences. So our next new feature is the Setup and Upgrade Wizard. It's a new utility that will run the very first time that you open SoundCheck after installing version 12, and you can choose to run it other times after that. The idea was that we wanted to make a utility that makes it easier for people to get their system up and running. So it does two main things. One, if you have a prior installation of SoundCheck on your system, the Setup Wizard will detect that, and it will help you transfer over your settings like hardware and calibration, as well as preferences and things stored in the .ini file. It'll also help you choose your status.dat file if you have not done so already, so that you can get the system into its unlocked mode. The other purpose for the Setup and Upgrade Wizard is to help people who don't already have a version of SoundCheck installed and help them get their hardware up and running. So we find that's one of the more confusing aspects of SoundCheck is getting your hardware all set, figuring out where to go to do that. So the wizard will auto-detect if you have any of the sound cards that we recognize, ones that we recommend and sell. If it detects one of those, it will tell you, and it'll give you the option to either enter in all of the calibration values that you'd like, or you can use default values that we have on file for that particular sound card. So based on your Windows OS and on your sound card that you have present, the Setup and Upgrade Wizard will automatically populate all of your hardware settings for you, making it a lot simpler to get the system up and running. So let me show you what the wizard looks like. So as I said, it runs the very first time you launch SoundCheck, or you can get to it here through the File menu. So the first thing it'll do is look for a valid status.dat, which I already have. My system's already unlocked. So if you have a valid hardware key and status.dat, then it will scan your system for previous versions of SoundCheck. So you see here I have a number of older versions installed on my system. But if I wanted to upgrade from 11.1, I could choose it here. Next. And then it asks if I want to import the system hardware and calibration. So for anyone using SoundCheck 11, this is kind of a no-brainer. It's a really easy way to move all your stuff over. If you're using versions of SoundCheck prior to 11, it will ask you which hardware step and which calibration step you would like to import. So I'll say yes. And now it's going to walk through the process of importing. And if any of my channels, signal paths, any of my calibrated devices already exist, it will give me a prompt about whether I'd like to overwrite them or not. Once you've brought over your hardware and calibration, it also gives you the option to copy and convert any sequences from your old version that you would like to. And if you say yes, then it'll bring up a prompt, and you can go through and choose any number of sequences from one folder that you would like to bring over. So I'm just going to choose this one here called 11.1 sequence. So once the wizard is finished running, you can either open the hardware editor to see your settings, open the self-test, or simply close the wizard. And now at this point, if I go into my hardware, you see that all of my settings have been brought over from version 11. My custom configuration here with AMP Connect and an RME multiface card. So next, we have opening SoundCheck without a sequence. So this is a new mode that you can use SoundCheck in, and it provides you a way to work with SoundCheck outside of a test sequence. So prior to version 12, you always had to have a SoundCheck sequence loaded from the very first time you open the program and then on forward. So now when you open SoundCheck, there will not be a sequence loaded by default. You can use the Quick Start menu or the Recently Opened mode to go and pick which sequence you'd like to open, or you can simply use SoundCheck in this mode. Now there's several uses for it. One of the more obvious ones is to open, view, and report data. So this gives you a really clean space to work with, where you don't have any sequence data in your memory list, you just have any data you've opened from disk. You don't have any display steps that are open, so you can create new graphs, new windows, make reports, and all of that without worrying about having an impact on your test sequence. It also allows you to use offline editors for post-processing data. So if you wanted to open some data from disk, run statistics, or use post-processing, run SoundMap, you could do all of those things here from this mode without a sequence. Now you can still do those while you have a sequence loaded. This just gives you a little bit cleaner space to do so. And you could also use the virtual instruments because the hardware and the calibration are basically initialized when you first open SoundCheck. So you have access to your hardware and calibration, which means you can make measurements using the virtual instruments without having a sequence loaded to do so. So switch back over to SoundCheck. So right now I have this complete test sequence open, and I can go up to File, Close, and now I'm in the no sequence mode, or the offline mode. So you see here we have no sequence listed in the yellow box. These buttons are disabled, showing us that we are in the offline mode. And if we take a look at our memory list, you see it's really quite empty. All we have are calibration values and curves, which starting in SoundCheck 12 are always auto-grouped. So you can keep them hidden if you're not using them. It also keeps the memory list a little bit cleaner. So now for my memory list, I could just go and open some data. Actually, I think from the recently used menu, here we go. So now I just have a group of curves, which I could then put on a graph, do some offline processing, run statistics, do whatever I want with the data, resave it. Once I've gotten everything onto a graph the way I want it, I could go up to the report menu here and say open reports. So this is your space for working with data, especially those that would like to do a bunch of measurements and then reopen their data later to do all their processing, or bring over production data from the plant and do some statistical analysis on it. This gives you a nice clean space to do all of that. And as I said, you can also go up under the Operate menu here and use your virtual instruments. Now, if you want to get to a sequence again, you just simply go up to File, Open, or you can go to the Recently Opened Files menu here and pick which test sequence you'd like to load. Our next feature is the tabbed displays. So you can see from the screenshot there that we now have introduced these tabs that are just below the Start menu. So each display step in your sequence will generate a display tab. And so you can click on the tabs, and they will allow you to switch back and forth between your various display steps in your sequence. So this gives you a nice, easy way to switch over from one tab to another and get from one display step to another. And it also gives you a nice visual indication of which display step you are currently editing. As before, the only way to get between display steps, well, obviously when you ran the sequence, it would go to a particular display as that step occurred. But it also, you were able to get to the steps through the Setup Display menu. So now you have a much simpler way of being able to just click on these tabs and move back and forth between them. There's also this Offline tab at the very left. And the Offline tab always appears, and it gives you a place to work with your data if you just really quick want to look at a few curves and bring them up without making a change to a display step, for example. So it gives you a place to go back to anytime during your sequence, and once you've finished running a sequence if you want to view some data. Also, when you were in the offline mode that I just showed you, the Offline tab is where you can work with your data. So let me open a sequence here that has a few display steps. I can kind of show you how this works. So you see I have a sequence here called max SPL versus frequency, and it has 3 display steps. So I have a tab for each one of these, as well as my offline tab that's always here. Now, if you have your sequence configured to show display when sequence opens, then SoundCheck will still do so, and your very first display in your sequence will pop up when you load the sequence. If you don't have that option checked in your configure section, then it will come up on the offline tab here. So on our offline tab, we can still view data if we'd like to. So we can pull up some data, make some new graph windows, do whatever we want with our data here. And now we can switch back over to any of the displays in our sequence, and you see that our offline tab still remains isolated from that. So at any time, we could always go back to our offline tab and view more data here if we'd like to. So by clicking on each of these tabs, you're basically opening that display step and are now in the edit mode for that display step. So now any changes I make here, I can potentially save as part of that display. So it's the same thing as going up to Setup, Display, and then choosing which step you'd like to open, but it gives you a much easier way to do so. Now we've also added some new right-click abilities with these tabs. So if you right-click on a tab, you have the option to load a different display template. You can take your current display and save it as a new template. The revert option, as well as you can go to new if you wanted, let's say, a new table window. You can also right-click in the main display space here if you just want a new window type. So here I can say new XY graph. So one example would be from the offline tab here, you may be working with some data and then create a set of windows that you would like to save for further use. So after you've gone through here and created a number of windows, have it set up just the way you want, you can right-click, go Save Display as Step Template. Once you've saved it as a template, now it's a file that's always available for you to either open from the offline menu through the load function, or you can put it into your sequence because it'll now show up in the templates list. Next, we have relative file paths. So all file paths that get used in the sequence can now be set relative to the location of the sequence file. So this is different from the way things used to be. The recall editor used to have a relative capability, but a number of the other step editors, you had to set an absolute file path, which could be problematic when moving sequences from one system to another. So if you think about an autosave, where you've designated autosave to go to a very particular folder on your hard drive, and if you had moved that sequence to a different system and that folder didn't exist, SoundCheck would give you some warnings that it couldn't find the designated folder. So now you can set your file path to a relative location so that as you move your sequence around, those file paths remain relative and you won't end up with any disconnected issues. So the steps that we've implemented this in include recall, autosave, both for saving the file path as well as for Excel templates, stimulus if you are using WAV files, and the print editor, the printing also for saving reports and template files as well. So basically, to use the relative file path, you use a blank file path instead of entering an actual location where you want it to go. And by having the file path be blank indicates to SoundCheck that you would like to use a relative selection. The relative always means that it's going to look in the folder where the sequence file resides. With the relative paths, we can also use subfolders. So you can enter a subfolder and then put your file name. You can even have multiple levels of subfolders that are used with this relative path. So in this way, you can contain everything that you need for your sequence, any files that get recalled, any WAV files, put your autosave folder, everything within the same folder as the sequence, and just move that around. Everything will be self-contained, and everything will be very portable. Now let me show you what that looks like. So in my sequence here, my max SPL versus frequency, I actually have two autosave steps. So currently, this step is set to use the default location, which is set to SoundCheck 12 data, which is fine, and that would allow me to move from one system to another, and as long as SoundCheck was stored here, it'll always save in the default location. My other option, though, is to now use the relative path. So if I just delete the file path entirely and leave it blank, I'm now telling SoundCheck save the data in the same folder as the sequence resides in. So it will save into my max SPL sequence folder. And if I hit apply, there's no data being run at the moment, but it'll still create the Excel file. So you see here's my sequence folder, and by telling it with the blank file path, it is now saved an Excel file right here in the main directory. Now, I did create this data subfolder before, so if I wanted it to store in there instead, I simply go in and type data. And now if I hit apply, you see that my new file gets generated right here. So by using these relative file paths, you can make your sequences a little bit more portable, make it easier to move them from one system to another without having to worry about having a very definitive folder structure in place before the sequence is run. Now we've kept the export function in SoundCheck 12. There is no longer an import function because there's no need to bring all the steps from a sequence into the directory. But if you export a SoundCheck sequence, it'll basically bundle up all the steps, all of the files that you need to run the sequence. So for example, if you had a DAT file that was being recalled by the sequence and you had a stimulus WAV file, by using the export operation, it will take the sequence file as well as those two files it'll bring them over into a single location, and it will set their file paths to relative so that now you have a sequence that can be easily moved from one place to another. SoundMap integration. So we introduced SoundMap a couple of years ago. It's a time frequency analysis program, and up until now it has just been a separate application. So to use it, you would have to generate your waveforms either in SoundCheck or some other program, and then you had to open SoundMap and bring them over. Well, now we've added it as an optional module in SoundCheck, and you can access it as an offline function, so from the offline menu up at the very top. So this allows you to select waveforms directly from the memory list. So any data that you've generated in SoundCheck is now available there to choose in SoundMap. But you can still, from SoundMap, open files, any of the file types that SoundMap was already able to deal with, including the .map files, which are SoundMap-specific files which can be saved once you've taken a waveform and analyzed it. So just to give a quick demonstration of where that's at. First of all, to use SoundMap in SoundCheck from the optional modules list, you need to have one of two modules enabled. And that would be SoundMap CSD, which is the version with just the cumulative spectral decay option, or the SoundMap Full, which includes all 4 analysis algorithms. So you need to have one of these two as part of your status.dat file on this license to be able to use it. And if you do, you go up to Offline, SoundMap, and it launches from here. So now to choose which waveform you want to analyze, you can either click the drop-down here and choose any of the waveforms that are already in the memory list, or you can click Browse and go find WFM file. So I've chosen this headphone from a particular WFM file. And now by choosing it here and browsing to it from disk, SoundCheck also creates a copy of it here in the memory list. So SoundMap and the memory list are now interactive. And from here, the program acts pretty much like it has before. You choose your waveform you want, choose your analysis algorithm, and then choose whatever parameters you'd like, and hit Analyze. Once you've analyzed the waveform, you have the option to save it as a .map file, or just do your analysis here in SoundMap. Next, we have the calibration editor reformat, which you can see here with these screenshots. So what we decided to do was change the way that the editor looks in order to reflect the relationship between the calibrated device and the hardware channel. So previously, we had the hardware channel listed down near the bottom of the window, or it was kind of in the middle. And what we wanted to do was put the calibrated device and the hardware channel side by side, because that's really what you're combining together to create what we used to call a signal channel and is now called a signal path. So, and this is the way that I generally show this in training, and if you've watched our calibration webinars before, you've probably seen that we've talked about it this way. So the signal path, the name at the top, is reflecting the fact that you have a connection between a physical hardware location and a set of calibration data. So we've just rearranged the editor to try to better represent that. Overall, though, the functionality remains the same. We changed the calibration editor back in SoundCheck 8, and really the functionality hasn't changed since then. This is just more of a GUI change to be able to help people better understand how this all works. There's a little triangle you can see on the editor, and if you click that, you can switch between the two views, the expanded view on the right side or the compact view you see on the left side. So depending on how much information you want to be able to see at any given time, just gives you a cleaner way to view the 3 paths. We've also added a hardware information table that you can see on the right side in the lower right-hand corner. So whichever hardware channel you have selected for a given signal path, it will give you a quick overview of the settings that are related to that hardware channel. So you can't edit it from here, but at least you can see all of the settings for your hardware channel without having to close the calibration and go back over to hardware to view that particular channel. So at least you'll know which hardware device that channel is being configured for and things like the sampling rate and bit depth. So last but not least is our new histogram in the offline statistics. So from here, users will be able to select a series of single values, and then it will output a histogram curve like the one you see down at the bottom. This will output a histogram as well as a Gaussian bell curve, which shows you the ideal distribution, and these appear as new curves in the memory list once you run the statistics editor. This is ideal for people doing production process control. Anyone who's dealing with a lot of single values wants to use this kind of tool along with CP, CPK, and have a little bit more expanded statistical analysis capability. So some typical values you might use for histogram would include the resonance, both the frequency, magnitude, perhaps even the Q, sensitivity, of course, THD max, any single values that you generate from production data or otherwise. So let me show you the new histogram function. So first I'm going to go back to my no sequence mode, my offline, just to make things a little bit cleaner. And also I'm going to clean out the memory list. Okay, so now I have a clean slate to start with. So first I'm going to need some data. So I'm going to go open a file that I generated before. Let's go find my file. So I created a group earlier that contains about 1,000 1 kilohertz sensitivity values from an earphone. 1,021. You can see we're stored in this DAT file. So that should give me a decent amount of data to use to run my histogram. So as you can see, I have serial numbers attached to all these, and it's quite a bit of data. So now I'm going to go to offline and statistics, and I'll just choose the offline step. So a couple changes that we've made to the statistics editor. One, you can see we've put in separators in this list between curves and values, whereas before it was hard to tell which one was which. So now you'll have a little bit easier way to look at this, kind of like you look at the memory list. So I'm going to choose all of my 1 kilohertz sensitivity values through a shift click. And now over on the right-hand side, you see I have a new option down here at the bottom called histogram. There's also an axis selection. And this axis selection applies to all of these functions here that you can see within this little box. So when I choose the histogram, I can choose which of my axes I want it to run on. Now with 1 kilohertz sensitivity, magnitude is really the only one that makes any sense. But for example, if you were doing a bunch of loudspeaker measurements and were calculating resonance, with resonance you have the frequency, the magnitude, and the Q on your 3 different axes. And you may want to run a histogram on all 3. So you have the option here to choose which one to use. So we select histogram, and now we need to generate our bin width. So this is choosing how wide each one of our bins is going to be in the histogram. So the smaller the bin width, the more bins you will have, and vice versa. So my 1 kilohertz sensitivity is in dB, so I'm going to be choosing how many dB wide each bin should be. I'm going to choose 0.5 because my sensitivity grouping is actually pretty tight. So now I'll have each bin will be 0.5 dB wide, and my histogram is going to tell me how many units fall within each one of those bins. So I'll click Apply, and then my new data gets generated here in my protected menu. Now you can see my data name, it ends up pulling the name of the first piece of data in the list, and then tacks on histogram and distribution after it, which is the default that SoundCheck has used with the statistics editor in previous versions. Now we've also added this custom data name field. So if I wanted to enter something else for myself, let's say I just want to put sensitivity, and I'll hit apply. So now my custom name gets used here, and you see I get a name that makes a little bit more sense to me rather than putting the name of the data at the top. So now I have sensitivity histogram and sensitivity distribution. So let's take a look at these. Now, if I just pull up my histogram on an XY graph, because it is a curve, it's not a great way to look at my data initially because by default the XY graph has a log axis on the x-axis, which I could change over to linear and change all the settings. But what I've done is saved myself a template previously because I created an XY graph that was already formatted specifically for my histogram, and then I saved it. So now I can load it here from my offline menu, and you see it's called histogram. So I pull that up on my offline tab, and you can even see it says histogram now, and you see my XY graph I've created specifically for this looks much nicer. I formatted the x-axis to be linear scale, and I changed some of my auto-scaling preferences, removed a few grid lines. So here's my histogram, and you can see I get these bar plots. This curve is automatically formatted this way to show with the bar plot. If you wanted to change how that looks, you could always go over and choose a different type of bar plot if you'd like. So each one of these bins represents half dB width, and then over on the y-axis we're showing the count of how many units fall within that bin. So you can see for 113.5 dB, I have about 210, 215 maybe. And then at 114, I have about 250 units that fall into that range. And so we get our distribution. And if we want to pull up the ideal distribution curve on top of it, you can see that here, we get our bell curve. So that's how you'll be using the histogram feature. First you need a bunch of single values, and then you can feed it into the offline statistics editor. So that's a quick wrap-up of the new features in SoundCheck 12. A lot of new ways to use the program and some new functionality. Now, for any of you who have a valid support contract that is still active, you will be receiving the download link to SoundCheck 12 as well as a new status.dat file in the very near future. We're just about set to release the program. For anyone who does not have a current support contract and wants to look at upgrading their system from a previous version, we are offering some special upgrade pricing for a limited time only. And you can see the table here, depending on what version you currently have, you can see the cost. We have the regular price listed there in the second column, and then our current promotional upgrade price listed next to that. So it is a very good time to take an old system and get it upgraded to the latest and greatest, as there's a number of really, really good upgrades in SoundCheck 12. This information is also available on the website if you'd like to take a look at it later. And if you want to get in touch with someone to ask about upgrading your system or check on a status of a support contract, please just send us an email at sales@listeninc.com, or you can call our main office at 617-556-4104. So I'm going to stop sharing my window here, go back to the main WebEx window, and let me get to my last slide here, and I'll take a look through the questions here to see if anyone has anything they would like to go through at the moment.